In 1985, a company fired the man who built it from nothing. He walked out of his own office with a box of belongings, unemployed, humiliated, and 30 years old. The board that fired him thought they were saving the business. What they actually did was set off a chain of events that would cost that company billions of dollars, nearly destroy it completely, and then, 12 years later, force them to beg that same man to come back and save it. This is not a story about revenge. It's stranger than that. It's a story about ego, blind spots, and the kind of decision that looks smart in a boardroom and looks insane in hindsight. The company was Apple. The man was Steve Jobs. Here's the part almost nobody remembers correctly. Jobs wasn't fired by some outside corporate raider. He was pushed out by a man he personally hired. In 1983, Jobs recruited John Sculley, the president of Pepsi-Cola, with a now-famous pitch. He reportedly asked Sculley if he wanted to sell sugar water for the rest of his life, or if he wanted a chance to change the world. Sculley took the job. 2 years later, Sculley sided with Apple's board against Jobs, and Jobs lost control of the company he co-founded in a garage. Let's back up, because to understand how strange this is, you have to understand what Apple even was. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak built computers by hand in Jobs' family garage in Los Altos, California. Wozniak was the engineer. Jobs was the one who understood something almost nobody in Silicon Valley understood yet. That computers didn't just need to be powerful, they needed to feel human. By 1980, Apple went public, and it made Jobs, at 25 years old, worth over $200 million. He was one of the wealthiest self-made people in America before most people his age had finished paying off student loans. Then came 1984. Apple launched the Macintosh with one of the most famous television commercials ever made. A commercial that aired during the Super Bowl and referenced George Orwell's vision of a controlled, conformist future. The message was clear. Apple was the rebel. Apple was different. For a moment, it looked like Jobs' obsession with design and simplicity was about to change computing forever. But here's what almost nobody knows. The Macintosh, despite the legendary launch, sold poorly at first. It was expensive. It was slow. Businesses didn't want it. Behind the scenes, tension inside Apple was building fast, and it wasn't really about sales numbers. It was about control. Jobs was brilliant, but he was also, by nearly every account from people who worked with him at the time, exhausting to work for. He would call a project genius one day and garbage the next. He humiliated employees in meetings. He set impossible deadlines and then blamed people when they missed them. Some engineers thrived under that pressure. Many others burned out or quit. The board watched Apple's earnings slip through 1984 and into 1985, and they started asking a dangerous question. What if the problem is Jobs himself? In May of 1985, the board stripped Jobs of his operational responsibilities. He kept his title as chairman, but he had no power. He was, in his own later words, effectively fired in public and left to figure out what came next in private. By September, he resigned completely and sold nearly all his Apple stock. The man who built the company was gone. Now picture this. Steve Jobs, 30 years old, no company, no clear plan, sitting with a fortune, but no purpose. Most people in that position would have quietly enjoyed the money and disappeared. Jobs did the opposite. He started a new computer company called Next. And then, almost as an afterthought, he spent $10 million buying a small computer graphics division from Star Wars director George Lucas. That tiny division had a name most people had never heard of, Pixar. At the time, this looked like the sad final act of a fallen tech prodigy. Next computers were beautiful but wildly overpriced, and barely anyone bought them. Pixar was bleeding money making short animated films and computer hardware nobody wanted. For years, it looked like Apple's board had been right all along. The genius had lost his touch. Meanwhile, back at Apple, something was going wrong that had nothing to do with Jobs' personality and everything to do with what happens to a company when the person who obsessed over its soul is no longer in the room. Under Sculley and later CEOs, Apple's product lineup exploded into confusion. By the mid-1990s, Apple was selling more than a dozen different, nearly identical models of Macintosh computers, and customers couldn't tell them apart. The company chased trends instead of setting them. Profits collapsed. In 1996 and 1997, Apple came dangerously close to bankruptcy. Analysts openly speculated the company might not survive the decade. This was Apple, the company that made the Macintosh. Circling the drain. Here's the twist that changed everything. Apple needed new operating system technology, and the fastest way to get it was to buy someone else's. In late 1996, Apple's leadership looked at the market and landed on Next, the company Jobs had built in exile. Apple bought Next for around $429 million. As part of the deal, Steve Jobs walked back through Apple's doors, not as an owner, but as an advisor. Within months, Apple CEO was pushed out, and the board, the same kind of board that had removed Jobs 11 years earlier, asked him to step in as interim chief executive. Intérim turn de permanent. The man who had been fired for being too controlling, too intense, too obsessed with detail, was now the only person the board trusted to save the company from collapse. What happened next is where the financial lesson really lives. So let's slow down here for a second because this is the part worth sitting with. Jobs didn't come back and simply do what he'd always done. He came back changed. He killed most of Apple's confusing product lines and narrowed the entire company down to 4 computers. He launched the colorful iMac in 1998, which brought Apple back to profitability almost immediately. And he brought a discipline to the company that hadn't existed before, an obsession not just with bold ideas, but with follow-through. Then the real payoff arrived. The iPod in 2001, the iTunes Store, the iPhone in 2007, which didn't just make Apple money, it redefined what a phone was for the entire planet. By the time Jobs passed away in 2011, Apple had become the most valuable company in the world, a title it has held on and off ever since, with a market value that has crossed $3 trillion in the years since his death. And Pixar, the little animation studio nobody wanted, it released Toy Story in 1995, the first fully computer-animated feature film in history. Pixar went public the same year and made Jobs a billionaire on that success alone. In 2006, Disney bought Pixar for about $7.4 billion in stock, a deal that made Steve Jobs the largest individual shareholder in the Walt Disney Company. The company Apple's board considered a distraction from Jobs' failures turned out to be one of the most valuable entertainment acquisitions in modern history. So here's the real question underneath all of this. If you're keeping score, Apple's board fired the person who would go on to build 2 separate multi-billion-dollar empires, and they had to buy one of those empires back just to survive. What does that actually teach us about decision-making? Psychologically, this is a textbook case of what happens when a group focuses on short-term pain instead of long-term value. Apple's board in 1985 was reacting to falling quarterly numbers and daily friction. They were solving for comfort in the boardroom, not for what the company would look like in 10 years. That's loss aversion in action. The fear of continued short-term losses outweighed the harder, more uncertain bet on long-term vision. It's the same bias that makes investors sell a great stock during a dip, or makes a business cut its best but most demanding team member, because managing them feels harder than losing them. There's also a lesson here about the difference between talent and comfort. Jobs was not easy to work with. That was real, and it wasn't a myth. But comfort and value are not the same thing. Boards, managers, and investors regularly confuse the two. They reward people who are pleasant and predictable, and they punish people who are difficult but irreplaceable, without asking which one is actually driving the outcome that matters. If you want to think about your own life through this lens, and if this idea is landing with you, drop a comment with what you'd have done in that boardroom in 1985, because there genuinely isn't an easy answer. The same intensity that builds something extraordinary can also make it miserable to be around. The Apple board wasn't wrong that Jobs was difficult. They were wrong about what difficulty was worth. This isn't just a story about one billionaire and one company. It shows up everywhere at a much smaller scale. Companies lose their most demanding, most visionary employees all the time. Not because that person failed, but because keeping them around felt uncomfortable in the short term. And most of those companies never get a second chance to buy their genius back for $429 million. Most of those decisions just quietly cost a business its future, with nobody ever writing a documentary about it. If this story changed how you think about long-term decisions versus short-term comfort, share it with someone who's making a big call right now, because sometimes the most valuable person in the room is also the hardest one to manage. Every open question from the start of this story is closed now. The board thought they were removing a liability. They were removing the one person who saw 20 years into the future, while everyone else was looking at next quarter's numbers. Jobs took that same vision, built it twice more from scratch, in a garage-stage computer company and a struggling animation studio. And both bets became worth more than most countries' entire economies. The lesson isn't that difficult people are always right. Most of the time, they're not. The lesson is that before you fire your best asset, whether it's a person, an idea, or a bet on the future, you'd better be absolutely certain you're solving the right problem. Because the market doesn't forgive short-term thinking. It just waits patiently to send you the bill. And if there's one thing this story from Apple's boardroom in 1985 proves beyond any doubt, it's this. The most expensive mistakes in business history rarely look like mistakes in the moment they're made. Subscribe to Money Elevate so you never miss the next story hiding in plain sight.